Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 16, The World of Early Industrial Capitalism. Now, last lecture we looked at the agricultural developments like the four-field crop rotation that helped revolutionize the production of food. Land was now able to be used more efficiently, and then there was also more land due to reclamation as well as the Enclosure Acts. Those same Enclosure Acts, you'll remember, drove many people off the land that they had worked on and their families had worked on for just generations. The more efficient use of land meant more food, and the fact that you could grow more food on less land meant that you could use some of that land then to raise sheep. And this became especially important after the 7 Years' War, when Britain really began to emerge as the dominant economic power in the world. You'll remember that they had the beginnings of that massive British Empire, still relatively small in the late 18th, early 19th century, but in all the areas that they were, there was a demand for English wool, and so with that demand, they needed more supply, and that meant using more land for raising sheep. This demand for wool also led to a revolution in the use of machines to help speed up the long process of taking the raw wool from sheep and then, turning it into the finished product of woolen cloth. So that was happening in the 1760s. Part of that revolution, was adapting machines like the spinning jenny, which you can see on the bottom left here, right there, to hydropower, making them able to be powered by water. But the Industrial Revolution really began to take off once James Watt did two things. One, he made steam efficient enough to, be useful. And then the second thing was he adapted his steam engine to incorporate rotational movement, which made it, adaptable for textile use and milling, so that it could, be used for these machines. So that's when the Industrial Revolution really took off, once James Watt came around. Between the Enclosure Acts and the adaptation of steam for these purposes, especially the textiles, many people could no longer make a living the way that their families had for, like I said, generations upon generations. In the case of the Enclosure Acts, they were driven off the land, and then, the people who had small textile manufactories type places couldn't really support themselves anymore either by, making wool and cloth the old way. Some of these people would emigrate to the United States, or, the colonies at first, and then once the U.S. broke off from Britain, to the U.S., or to Australia, but many others would find new opportunities closer to, their traditional homes, but in places like growing towns and cities. And it was in these new developing urban centers that there were jobs, right? Because those were where the factories were growing. So as these cities were growing more and more people came into them, from the countryside looking for those jobs in the factories, we begin to see the lives that these people, lived were drastically changed. So there's a big change in lifestyle from, being out in the country to moving to these cities and then working in these factories. One of the biggest changes was who you worked for. When you were a small landowner or a small shop owner, you worked for yourself, right? I mean, you raised that food on your own land and you used it. If you had a small shop, or you were a small little textile manufactory, you would make that, you would gain the money from it, and then that was your living. Even those who worked the land for other people, they still earned a noticeable share of the profits, right? So they would work the land, they took a good share of that, and then they gave a little bit to the landowners. So they were still able to support themselves that way, and it was a noticeable share of profits. In factories, the workers toiled for owners, and these owners were people they rarely ever saw, and really, they didn't see a great share in the profits either. They had their meager wages that they worked for, but that was about it. Like, it wasn't the same thing as growing this food and you get a tangible feel to it. They had meager wages while these invisible owners were really profiting from the factories. In terms of like what governed their life, that was a drastic change too. In the countryside, their lives were governed by the sun and the seasons. So they would work when the sun was out, and the time of the year determined what type of work they were doing, right? In the spring and summer, you'd be tending to the fields. The fall, you'd be harvesting. The winter, there'd be winter crops, or you'd be doing some other type of task. In the city, the worker basically lived according to the factory's hours, and these hours were stressed by the use of whistles and bells, right? That told them when they had to work. And so it wasn't so much seasonal, and it wasn't by the sun. It could be at any time, because remember, these factories could run 24/7. No matter the season or time of day, those factories just could keep going. The healthy, active life of, working outdoors was also replaced by spending 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week working inside. The healthy diet of the countryside, where people ate the food that they grew themselves or that their neighbors had grown, was basically replaced by whatever foods they could find in the local shops. Bread was the main staple both in the countryside and in the city, but the quality of bread was quite different, right? The bread that you have grown from your own cereal, or that you make from your own cereals, is going to be different from the bread that is available for the shops in the cities. Usually a much better quality and fresher for the ones that had their own land. So working these long hours with less healthy food, and then you factor in that these were especially close quarters, that helped lead to outbreaks of disease. Another factor was also that factories were often quite dirty. Like I said, it's close quarters, so you're around people. And in the textile factories, there was lots of fluff floating around in the air. In the process of making clothes, little pieces of fluff would come off from the thread, or making the thread, and it would just be floating in the air that everyone was breathing. So this could lead to lung diseases, and if a spark hit it from somewhere, the place could actually go up in flames. So it was a pretty dangerous style work. And that's to say nothing of the dangers of working with moving machines, for a long time. This is a very repetitive job. So now, in the video that you hopefully watched before watching this one, that really showed, it was a good representation of what it would be like in a factory. In these screenshots, we can kind of see, here's all that fluff that I was talking about, right? So in the process of making the cloth and making the thread and all that, there is lots of particles from the wool and later cotton that would just be floating around in the air. And I wish the scene that you had watched actually went on a little bit further, because the actual scene from the BBC's miniseries North and South, which is a really good miniseries, but the actual scene of that goes on, and the clip that you watched ends right before the power of the floor manager is really shown. In it, Mr. Thornton, who's the floor manager, catches a worker trying to smoke a pipe in the factory, and then he proceeds to beat him physically. Now, Mr. Thornton did have his reasons for this, since, like I said, if a spark hit one of these pieces of fluff, the whole place could go up in flames. So, he had a little bit of a reason there, but, to be able to physically beat someone is a tremendous amount of power. And that's what these factory managers had, the people running the factories for the factory owners. So let's discuss a bit more about being inside the factories. And, these are especially the factories in the early 19th century, and really through the 19th century. As I mentioned, you had 12 to 14-hour shifts. That was the norm. 16-hour days were not unheard of, but 12 to 14-hour shifts were the norm. So just imagine spending 12 to 14 hours a day standing over the same machines, doing the same work. Highly repetitive, standing pretty much the whole time. You have minimal breaks, but this is all happening 6 days a week too. So you get Sunday off for for religious purposes, but this is 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week of the repetitive same work standing with minimal breaks. And just kind of think of the dangers if your mind wanders a bit, or if you grow tired from all those hours. You're working with these heavy moving machines. It could be rather dangerous. The bathrooms in these early factories were not much more than holes in the ground. There was no indoor plumbing early on, so that was where you went to the bathroom. And in general, the sanitation was poor. Not just all the fluff floating around, but, it was a rather dirty place from that fluff and from the other byproducts. And as you saw in the North to South clip, obviously the air was very polluted from that fluff, causing diseases like tuberculosis and emphysema, and other lung diseases. Factories were also very noisy. And here's an example of kind of what one would sound like. And you get the idea. So that is what you are basically hearing. That's a modern day power loom in India. Now, imagine hearing that for 12 to 14 hours in a row. And it's not just that, because that's just one power loom. Now imagine a factory filled with over 100 of these, and how loud that would be, and how repetitive it would be. Yeah, so there's a lot of noise pollution as well. The workforce in these factories consisted of men, which you can see there's some men there, women, there's a woman there, and children, even as young as 6 years old, could work in factories. Here we could see some children there. There's a little girl right there. And that's because the entire family basically needed to work in order to support themselves. Here you can see some boys working the machines. This little one right here doesn't even have shoes on. How safe is that? But sometimes these families couldn't even afford shoes. And not just boys, but girls would work with the machines as well. And again, this little girl doesn't have shoes on either. Now, obviously, kids offer an extra set of arms to work machines, but why were children especially useful for factories of this time? The answer to that is their size. When a machine would jam up, children were the ones who were small enough to climb under or into the machines in order to grab what was clogging it. And in fact, here we see a drawing of a little girl climbing out from under the machines as these two boys, are just trying to comfort each other with their life. And you could kind of see the better off factory managers there in their nice clothes. You can see the big class differences there in this drawing. But yeah, so these little children were able to go into these machines, pull out a jam. But if you're a factory owner, you don't really want to shut down production whenever things jam up. So as soon as things are unclogged, they start to run again. And it was not uncommon for someone to remove a jam and the machine starts up again and they lose a finger. And that's kind of like the best case scenario. I mean, obviously the best is you get lucky and you don't get caught at all. But, losing a finger, not uncommon. Hopefully your hand doesn't get crushed or something else like that. The size of children also made them very useful in mines, and women were useful in mines as well because they were, a little shorter than men. And this meant that, the mining company didn't have to dig as big of tunnels, right? If you could put these little kids in, you don't have to worry about, needing a full-size tunnel. And here we could see, children pushing up a cart. And then here's a little boy, either from Utah or Colorado, but look at him just smoking a pipe, ready to go work in the mines. It's crazy. It's really crazy the amount of the labor that children were expected to complete. Now, those who did live into old age, and there was only a few who were able to make it into old age during this time, but were no longer able to work the machines. They could be hired to help sweep the floors, try and tidy things up, but once they were no longer useful, they would just be cast aside. And the same is true for people who got injured on the job. Let's say somehow your hand gets completely crushed and you can't use it anymore. Well, there was no such thing as workers' compensation. That was up to the factory owner whether they wanted to give you any money because they felt bad or not. but usually people were just kind of thrown out if they weren't useful anymore. And that's really because the workers were not seen as really any different than the cogs that were in the machines, right? They were just part of the process to make these goods that got the factory owners wealthy. This also meant that, people of all ages were subject to the punishments of the floor manager. So little kids to elders could all be punished, subject to the same punishments of the floor manager. So really not, these people are kind of dehumanized a bit. And the workers in these factories were being subjected to all of this for, like I said, meager wages. Of course, that's better than no work at all, or, starving on the land in the countryside because you can't support yourselves anymore. But these are really low wages. You can see that a child under 11 would make 2 shillings and 3 to 4 pence a 6-day week. The men got paid higher as they got older. Women are paid quite less than men, which is still happening today, and these ones were even more drastic than that. Now, to give you some perspective on what this means, like what a shilling you would buy, or a pence, to have a loaf of bread a day for a week would cost about 1 shilling. So, a male could probably feed himself for 1 shilling. But, that's take up around 15% of his salary when it's all like factored in. And women earning much less obviously would have a harder time supporting themselves. So when you're trying to support a family, because most men had families, so it would cost quite a bit, because the other members of the family are not making nearly as much as the head of the household, right? I mean, you could see just how much the wife would be making, or daughters, or the children, until they grow to be old enough to start getting paid, if they're male, a decent salary. And even then, so these are the wages in 1830. They're not always these wages are not going to be always the same. They'll go up, they'll go down. So yeah. Okay, so that's kind of inside the factories in a nutshell, and it's a little bit depressing. So that's quite enough depressing stuff for a little bit. Let's imagine that finally our 14-hour shift has ended. Yay. Thank goodness. Now we get to go home. Leaving the factory, the skyline would look something like this. This is Manchester, in kind of northwestern England. And so that's the skyline, and you can see how cramped and crowded the roads would be, and the houses being right there, houses and shops. So everything is all kind of like cramped together, smoggy. So you leave the poor air quality in the factory due to the fluff. Now you get all the smog coming off of the factory towers. And it probably wouldn't take us long to get home, because the building wouldn't usually be that far from the factory. They want you to be there so you can get to work really easily. So the building that most people would live in would have a room that the entire family would share. Oftentimes, these buildings would be owned by the factory owners themselves. So you're kind of paying your rent to the person who's paying your paycheck, so they're just kind of making their money back. Because early on, very few families could afford to own their own house. So like I said, the building you're living in, not very far from the factory. You share one room with the entire family, all cramped in, and often those owners would be, or the building owners would be the same as the factory owners. The bathroom for these buildings was pretty much a hole in the ground as well. There was a shared outhouse in the yard, and this was only really emptied if the families in the building could pay for it. No one's going to come clean this out of the benefit of their, or out of the kindness of their hearts. The families inside the building had to pay for this. And these were the living conditions for most of the factory workers, especially early on. But luckily, I say this luckily due to working such long hours, your free time was basically consumed with eating and sleeping before having to go to work again. Here you can see a drawing of the family cramped into their room. Everyone's asleep except for this woman who's watching over this poor, hopefully just sick and sleepy child. Hopefully not dying. But that's really, the living conditions for most of these people. And so, again, these were drastic changes in the way of life and the style of living that people were feeling as they were moving from the countryside in. And these were the daily changes that the lower classes were feeling. But industrialization also had larger social impacts that are kind of similar to what we saw in the beginning of the semester when we talked about the Renaissance. You'll recall from the Renaissance lecture that the nobility during the Middle Ages were the ones who had the power, and their power was based on the fact that they owned the land due to their connections to the king. You'll also remember how at the end of the Middle Ages and into the beginning of the Renaissance, there was a new class developing, the merchant class, who grew in wealth due to trade, not land. And this wealth that they got from trade led to them becoming more powerful. In England, the members of the merchant class began to enter the House of Commons in Parliament, and then some would even enter into the House of Lords after gaining titles, and thus they were able to become a part of the government itself, right? And an integral one, as we'll recall, the House of Commons began to control more and more of the royal purse. Remember, one of the big feuds that Charles I had that led to his execution was the fact that the House of Commons was the one in charge of the money, and, he did not like that. Now, we're going to see a similar phenomenon occur during the Industrial Revolution. There was a rise in wealth and power of a new class, and this class were the industrialists. Industrialists were the owners or investors in factories and new technologies, the new industrial technologies. These were the people who were investing in that and owning the factories. They're the ones who are making the big profits. Like the merchants, the wealth of these industrials led them to becoming members of the House of Commons in Parliament. And then also similarly, some would become so powerful that they would gain titles and even enter into the House of Lords. This picture here that you see is actually of American industrialists, including Cornelius Vanderbilt, but this is kind of the same idea that's happening in England. These industrialists getting wealthy off of the backs of their workers. Now, with many industrialists entering both houses of Parliament, and then also having allies, who do you think they cared? Who they cared for more? themselves or the workers whose labor they had been already profiting from? Not surprisingly, the answer is themselves. In 1799 and 1800, Parliament passed two different acts. These are different combination acts. Together they forbade the formation of unions and then thus collective bargaining. Now, unions is a bit of a charged term in modern discourse. But I will say this. I don't care, how you feel about modern unions or, like how corrupt you feel they are. I can pretty much guarantee that without the ability to form unions and to collectively bargain, working conditions would not be where they are today if people didn't get those opportunities. So, like I said, modern unions, you can view them in any way you want to, but without the ability to form unions and to bargain collectively, changes would not occur to the scale that they did. While there were definitely many industrialists and their allies in Parliament, there was also a group called the Liberals in Parliament as well. And again, similarly with the word union, let's try not to put our modern definition of liberals or our modern, beliefs or senses. Let's not tie that into these liberals too much, because these liberals really are they're not too different, but they're different. These liberals sought to investigate the working conditions and then to make legal changes in favor of the workers. So again, don't think about the politically charged definition of liberals that exists today. Try and separate that as much as you can from these liberals who are just working on investigating the conditions of workers and trying to make legal changes that would benefit them. A pivotal moment occurred in 1819 in Manchester, that town in kind of northwest England, and really one of the major industrial cities in all of England. And more specifically, it was at St. Peter's Field in Manchester. On August 16th, 1819, a crowd of 60 to 80,000 people gathered to demand more fair voting rights. At the time, voting was restricted to males who owned land with a rental value of 40 shillings a year. That comes to about £80 or so in 2008. So it's not a crazy amount that you have to, your land doesn't have to be incredibly valuable, but that's still, the fact of owning land is still something very difficult for a lot of workers. These are people who have been removed from their land or have been driven from their land either by physical force or by just the conditions, so they don't have land anymore, and their wages don't really allow them to buy them that much. Eventually over time they might, but not many are going to meet the land qualifications, is what I'm saying. Not many of the people who are working in the factories are going to meet the land requirements. And then to make voting even more limited, the votes could only be cast in the town of Lancaster, which is roughly 55 miles away from Manchester. And that's true for all of the county. Everybody who had to vote had to go to the town of Lancaster. So not only did a majority of the workers not meet the land condition, the few who might actually own enough land to do, or own land valuable enough to do so, would have had a tough time going 55 miles away to vote. Then, to make matters worse for these workers, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, those wars against Napoleon, saw a slight economic dip for Great Britain. And in response, the industrialists cut the wages of the working men from 15 shillings a day, or 15 shillings, a week, to 5 shillings. That's a huge cut. They're making 33% of what they used to. And remember, a loaf of bread at this time is around 1 shilling. If you want to be able to get a loaf of bread a day to support just one person, that costs around 1 shilling. So drastic cuts to the wages of men, and probably the same for women and children as well. So there's this really intense worker-filled protest, right? It's for voting rights so that they can feel represented. And what the local magistrates do in response to this, protest is they called in the military. And the military was called in to hopefully arrest the organizers of this protest. These people here, trying to stand up, and rally the workers. The way that the military went about this was they had the cavalry charge upon the crowd with their sabers drawn. And in the chaos, basically the chaos resulted in 15 people being killed or, later dying from injuries that they had, and about 400 to 700 others injured. This event would be, ironically, and purposely called Peterloo, and that was to invoke the name Waterloo, because remember Waterloo was the famous battle where Napoleon lost to the United Europe, but especially the British, and it had a famous cavalry charge upon Napoleon. So because of the use of the cavalry here against the workers, people would, kind of mockingly call it Peterloo. And in fact, one of the people who died from his wounds, a man named John Less, he was a factory worker in Manchester, and he had fought at Waterloo. Before his death, this happened in August. He died in mid-September, finally, from the wounds. But before his death, he said that Peterloo was more dangerous than Waterloo. And he said, quote, "At Waterloo, there was man-to-man, but this was downright murder," end quote. So, at least they had a fighting chance at Waterloo. This was just a massacre, really. And the Peterloo Massacre really began to change public opinion in favor of the workers and the liberals who were trying to help them. Here you can see a George Cruikshank caricature, mocking those responsible for the massacre, those who had, called in the military and the military itself. And we can see here's the commander of the cavalry, and he's telling his rather, well-fed troops, who are just massacring these poor, defenseless, rather skinny and gaunt workers and people and just citizens. This is what he's telling them in this little caption: "Down with them! Chop 'em down, my brave boys! Give them no quarter! They want to take our beef and pudding from us! And remember, the more you kill, the less poor rates you'll have to pay. So go at it, lads! Show your courage and loyalty." Now, it basically perfectly encapsulates, something that still occurs where people can't. It is really easy for people to argue like, oh well, if someone's getting raising up their own status, if someone's raising their status, then that must be a negative for me, which isn't the case at all. In most cases, right? There isn't some like zero sum thing where people, if some people gain rights, others lose them. No, that's not the way things work for the most part. But that's kind of what they're saying, like they want to take our beef and pudding, is how George Cruikshank puts this. And then he also has this idea of like, the more you kill, the less poor rates you'll pay. A poor rate was a tax that people paid in order to help support the poor people who couldn't support themselves, to make sure people were fed, kept warm. So it's a rather biting criticism here in this caricature. And it kind of gets at least some idea of what a portion of the people were feeling after this massacre. Using the momentum from, in the change of the public opinion, the Combination Acts were repealed 5 years later in 1824. Now, just because the Combination Acts were repealed, it was still very, very difficult to form unions. And that's because oftentimes workers were scared because the owners could still fire them. And being fired could be a big deal. If a worker was fired, and especially for being a quote-unquote troublemaker, they could also easily be kicked out of their housing, especially if the factory owner was the one who owned the building. And furthermore, the worker might be blacklisted by the owner. Basically, what blacklisting means is the owner would tell all the other factory owners in the area, and even further in England, not to hire this worker because he's or she is a troublemaker. And that could be true for entire families too. I mean, if you get fired, they might fire the rest of your family too. And now, how are you going to support all of you? There's a lot of fear in forming unions because of that. But still, people eventually, would form unions, despite this fear of being fired and blacklisted, and despite the other pressures and difficulties. And here we see a group of women and men who have formed this kind of union in 1888. Further changes occurred in part to the use of a new tool for the liberals, and those were blue books. Those mean, unfair, tyrannical liberals would force the poor, defenseless industrialists to write essays where those industrialists had to pretend that they were some figure in history and say how they would react in the situation. And then even worse, those terrible liberals, would force the poor, unfortunate victims to choose their topics, the topic options randomly. Wait a second. That's not right. That doesn't sound right at all. That's what I did to you guys. No. The blue books that we're talking about are these governmental reports that would get their nickname due to the blue covers that they had. These reports, besides having detailed notes, would also include drawings that were made by artists who were sent with the investigators to, draw what they saw. Here we can see some of the drawings that accompanied this particular blue book. In 1833, a Factory Act was passed that was really especially concerned with child labor. From it, children under 9 couldn't work in textile mills anymore, and children under 18 couldn't work at night. There's some small concessions there. Further, children 9 to 13 couldn't work more than 8 hours a day, and they had to get an hour lunch, and they also had to go to school for 2 hours a day. And that school was being taken from their wages, so they paid for that school by having their wages reduced. Children 14 to 18 couldn't work more than 12 hours anymore, and they had to include an hour lunch. So that's the Factory Act of 1833. There were many more Factory Acts that would pass over during, as things progressed. Some would raise the amounts of hours that children could work again. Others would lower them back down. And in general, there was a progressive swing to it. So things got better for children, and not just children, but women and all workers, due to these Factory Acts. And due to the report that you see right here, there was in fact a Mines Act passed in 1842. You can see right here, there's 1842 on this blue book, and the same year a Mines Act was passed. This said that no female could work underground, no matter her age, nor could boys under the age of 10 work underground. But as soon as you hit 10 years old, you better get underground. But it's some positive change, right? As the industrial age continued on, workers continued to fight for better treatment throughout all of the industrial countries. And due to their fight, eventually we arrive with the regulations that we have in place today. And we're lucky for what we have. Not everywhere in the world has such regulations, but at the same time we need to be vigilant, because you hope that things could still get better for people who are working. Or at the very least, you hope that the regulations that we have, the liberties that we have, will remain. Because there's sometimes when it feels like they might not be. With that, we end the impact of the industrialization in the societal sense. For the next lecture, what we're going to look at is a movement that's going to be highly influenced due to the industrialization, and in many ways is a response to industrialization. And that's called Romanticism. So that's what we'll look at during the next lecture. This is Greg, signing off.